Self-talk, the ongoing internal dialogue we have with ourselves, plays a powerful role in shaping how our brain functions and evolves over time. This isn't just a philosophical idea, it's grounded in the neuroscience of neuroplasticity. Neuroplasticity refers to the brain's ability to change its structure and function in response to experience. What we often overlook is that our own thoughts and language can be some of the most potent experiences the brain encounters. When you engage in self-talk, whether positive, neutral, or negative, you are, in a very real sense, giving your brain instructions on how to wire itself. The brain operates through networks of neurons that fire together in patterns. When certain patterns are repeated through behavior, emotion, or thought, those neural pathways are strengthened. This is the essence of the phrase neurons that fire together wire together. So, if every day you tell yourself, I'm not good enough, or I can't do this, those thought loops become reinforced. The brain becomes more efficient at producing those patterns, not because they're true, but because they're familiar. Repetition, not truth, determines which circuits get built. This means that if we want to change the way we think, feel, and act, one of the most accessible entry points is our own self-talk. When you consciously choose your internal language, repeating phrases like I'm capable, I'm learning, or I can adapt, you begin to form and reinforce new pathways. Over time, these become the dominant circuits. This is known as self-directed neuroplasticity, the ability to guide your brain's rewiring through intentional thought. It's like mental weightlifting. The more you repeat constructive thoughts, the stronger those mental muscles become. Importantly, this is not about blind optimism or denying reality. It's about using accurate but empowering language that engages the brain's learning and adaptive systems. The prefrontal cortex, which governs planning, decision making, and conscious control, is highly influenced by the language we use. Telling yourself, I can handle this challenge, or I've overcome hard things before, activates regions of the brain associated with focus and emotional regulation. In contrast, negative self-talk often lights up the amygdala and other parts of the limbic system tied to stress and fear. Over time, if your internal dialogue is filled with negativity, your brain becomes more reactive, more anxious, and less resilient. Another interesting element is that the brain doesn't always distinguish well between imagined and real experiences. This is why visualization, mental rehearsal, and positive affirmations can be so effective. If you tell yourself every day, I am disciplined, and pair that statement with real actions, even small ones, the brain begins to incorporate that identity. It doesn't just hear the words, it experiences them chemically and structurally. Dopamine, a neurotransmitter involved in motivation and reward, is often released when we tell ourselves things that align with effort, learning, or progress. For instance, when you say, I'm getting better every day, and you believe it, dopamine reinforces that loop and makes it more likely you'll take actions aligned with that belief. But here's the key: consistency. Just like going to the gym once doesn't build muscle, saying something once won't change your brain. The repetition of specific, empowering self-talk over days, weeks, and months is what leads to actual structural change. The brain needs repeated signals to decide that something is important enough to rewire around. This is also why becoming aware of your automatic self-talk patterns is crucial. Much of our internal dialogue runs on autopilot, shaped by childhood, past experiences, or cultural programming. But once you bring those patterns into conscious awareness, you can start to replace unhelpful language with more adaptive alternatives. For example, instead of I always mess this up, you can practice saying I'm learning and improving each time. This doesn't deny past mistakes. It redirects focus toward growth and progress, which engages different parts of the brain and opens new pathways for behavior. In essence, every time you speak to yourself, you're conducting a form of mental training. You are either reinforcing circuits that keep you stuck or building circuits that move you forward. The good news is that you have far more control over this than you think. With conscious practice, the simple act of choosing your words carefully, internally and externally, can become one of the most powerful tools for transforming how your brain works, how you experience the world, and who you ultimately become. Language is not just a means of communication. It is a tool that shapes our inner world, emotions, and physiological states. The words we use, especially in self-talk, can either elevate our mental state or drag it down. Modern neuroscience has shown that language doesn't merely describe how we feel, it can actually determine how we feel. Every word, phrase, and sentence activates specific neural networks, influences hormone release, and can even alter the way we perceive ourselves and our environment. When we say things like "I'm overwhelmed," "I can't take this anymore," or "this is impossible," we aren't just stating our feelings. We are instructing the brain to align our emotional and physiological state with those words. Language has a direct impact on areas of the brain like the amygdala, which plays a central role in processing emotions, especially fear and stress. When we use negative or catastrophic language, even internally, we can trigger the same fight or flight response as if we were facing an actual physical threat. This results in increased heart rate, muscle tension, and the release of stress hormones like cortisol and adrenaline. On the flip side, when we use calming, constructive, or empowering language, we stimulate the prefrontal cortex, the part of the brain responsible for reasoning, planning, and emotional regulation. This helps reduce activity in the stress centers of the brain, allowing us to feel more grounded, focused, and capable. A simple shift from saying, "I'm anxious," to "I'm feeling some energy before this challenge," can redirect your brain's interpretation of the situation. Instead of treating the feeling as a threat, the brain starts to see it as a signal of readiness or alertness, which can enhance performance and clarity. This isn't about lying to ourselves or pretending things are fine when they're not. It's about accurately framing our experience in a way that gives us access to better internal resources. Words carry emotional charge, and depending on how we use them, they can either escalate a stress response or help us move into a more regulated, empowered state. The language we use sets the emotional tone for our inner narrative. Think of it like the operating system that runs quietly in the background, constantly influencing every thought, choice, and interaction. One of the most profound examples of language affecting state is seen in the practice of labeling emotions, what psychologists call affect labeling. When people simply name what they're feeling, "I feel angry," "I feel frustrated," "I feel nervous," brain imaging studies show a decrease in amygdala activity and an increase in prefrontal regulation. In other words, putting feelings into words helps to regulate those feelings. It's like giving your brain a handle to grasp onto a slippery experience, making it easier to manage. Language also affects our perception of difficulty and our willingness to engage with challenges. If you repeatedly tell yourself, "This is too hard," your brain starts to down-regulate motivation circuits. But if you change that to "This is hard, but I can figure it out," you activate problem-solving networks and increase persistence. The difference might seem subtle, but to your brain, it's significant. The words you choose don't just describe your experience, they shape it. Another fascinating insight is that the brain doesn't distinguish strongly between internal and external language. The words you say out loud to others and the ones you silently whisper to yourself both shape your state. This is why harsh self-criticism can be so damaging. If someone else spoke to you the way you sometimes speak to yourself, you'd probably call it verbal abuse. Yet internally, we often allow that kind of language to run unchecked. Over time, this erodes confidence, dampens motivation, and increases the likelihood of depression and anxiety. Conversely, supportive, encouraging self-talk fosters a sense of safety, confidence, and forward momentum. Saying things like, I'm doing the best I can, I've handled difficult things before, or I'm learning through this, can help create a neurochemical environment of dopamine and serotonin, neurotransmitters linked to motivation and well-being. These words cue your brain that it is safe to keep moving forward, even in the face of difficulty. Ultimately, the language we use is one of the most direct tools we have for influencing our state of being. It costs nothing, is always accessible, and can be practiced anywhere, but like any tool, it must be used intentionally. Becoming aware of your habitual language patterns, challenging the unhelpful ones, and choosing words that guide you toward resilience and clarity can transform not just how you feel, but how you show up in the world. In every moment, your words are either building your brain up or breaking it down. The choice is yours. Repetition is one of the most powerful forces in the human brain. It doesn't just help us remember facts or learn skills. It actually shapes who we believe we are. The identity we carry, the way we perceive ourselves, and the behaviors we default to are all largely the result of repeated patterns of thought, emotion, and language. Neuroscience confirms that repetition builds and strengthens neural pathways, meaning the more frequently a particular thought or belief is activated, the more likely it becomes the default response. Over time, repeated self-talk and behaviors don't just reflect your identity, they become it. The brain is a pattern detection machine. It is constantly scanning for information that confirms what it already believes to be true. This is partly due to something called the reticular activating system, which acts like a filter, prioritizing the information that aligns with our current beliefs and values. If you tell yourself repeatedly, "I'm not disciplined," your brain begins to notice and reinforce moments that align with that statement, such as skipping a workout or procrastinating, and ignores or downplays the times you did show discipline. Repetition gives these thoughts credibility in your neural architecture, reinforcing the story until it becomes self-perpetuating. This is why affirmations, mental rehearsal, and consistent internal narratives are so impactful. They aren't just feel-good tools. They're rewiring your brain through the same mechanisms that allow you to learn any new skill. The principle of Hebbian learning, often summarized as neurons that fire together wire together, means that each time you repeat a certain thought or phrase, those neurons become more efficient at communicating with each other. Over time, the thought becomes automatic, often occurring without your conscious input. It becomes a part of how your brain defaults to interpreting the world and yourself. Consider how identity forms in childhood. A child who is repeatedly told they are smart, brave, or creative begins to internalize those words, not because they objectively are those things all the time, but because repetition creates belief. The same applies in adulthood, except now we're often the ones reinforcing the message. If our self-talk consistently contains phrases like "I'm a failure," "I'm always anxious," or "I never get it right," we condition ourselves into those roles. These aren't just casual thoughts, they're identity statements, and the brain takes them seriously. What makes repetition particularly effective in shaping identity is emotional salience. The more emotion that's tied to the repeated thought, the faster and deeper it is encoded. Saying "I'm a loser" once while feeling neutral doesn't have much power, but saying it often, especially during moments of emotional intensity, wires it in more firmly. The emotional charge amplifies the brain's plastic response. That's why it's not just what you repeat, but how often and how emotionally engaged you are when repeating it that determines its impact. However, this works just as powerfully in the positive direction. Repeating statements like "I'm becoming more focused," "I follow through on my commitments," or "I can handle stress with clarity" starts to rewire your brain toward those traits. Even if you don't fully believe them at first, the brain responds to consistency. Initially, it may feel like a lie, but with time and repetition, your brain adjusts to the new narrative. Eventually, the repetition becomes belief, and belief becomes identity. Behavior also plays a critical role. Repetition isn't only verbal, it's behavioral. When you repeatedly take actions aligned with a desired identity, even in small ways, you send strong signals to the brain that this is who I am now. For example, if you want to build the identity of someone who is healthy, each time you exercise, hydrate properly, or prioritize sleep, you're not just helping your body, you're reinforcing that identity. The repetition of action gives the brain evidence, and the more evidence you collect, the more natural and effortless the identity becomes. It's important to note that identity is not static. People often think of identity as fixed, when in reality, it's flexible and trainable. Through deliberate repetition, you can sculpt your identity into one that serves your goals, values, and growth. You can shift from someone who procrastinates to someone who takes initiative, from someone who doubts to someone who trusts themselves. But like any transformation, it requires consistent, conscious repetition. In the end, the stories we tell ourselves most often become the foundation of who we are. If you want to change your life, start by changing what you repeat, because repetition doesn't just influence identity, it creates it. And the most empowering truth of all is this: you get to choose what you repeat.